The desert wind was quiet that night. No birds, no engines, just the low hum of military lights flickering across the fence of Camp Voltaire, a heavily fortified French military base deep inside Burkina Faso. At exactly 01:47 a.m., a convoy appeared. On the horizon, blacked-out SUVs with no license plates, no flags, and no warning. The French guards scrambled, radios buzzed, spotlights turned. The convoy rolled to a halt just meters from the gate. From the front vehicle, the door opened slowly, and out stepped President Ibrahim Traoré, alone, unarmed, unshaken. He wore no armor, no sash, just a plain, sand-colored shirt, and the red beret the world had come to recognize. The French soldiers looked at each other, stunned. "Identify yourself immediately," one barked, unsure whether to salute or aim. Traoré looked up at the looming steel gate and said only 4 words. "I want to come in." "This is a French military zone, Mr. President," the officer snapped. "We operate under Paris command. Entry is not permitted, even to you." A long pause followed. Traoré stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until only the gate separated him from the men with rifles. "And this," he said firmly, his voice echoing through the desert night, "is African soil." Behind him, his convoy stayed still. Not one guard moved, not one weapon raised. Inside the command tower, sirens began to wail softly. The French didn't know whether to open the gate or prepare for history. And just like that, a line was crossed, not by armies, but by one man's footsteps. The storm didn't begin with thunder. It began with a flash drive slipped under a locked office door. Inside the envelope was a short, unsigned message. "They're storing eyes in our sky, without your permission." Attached, a classified intelligence report, satellite images, shipping manifests, heat maps, all pointing to one location, Camp Voltaire, the French military base operating under joint agreements, but never fully transparent. But what chilled President Ibrahim Traoré wasn't the hardware, it was the implication. Dozens of advanced surveillance drones, unmarked but traced to French contracts, were being stored on Burkinabé soil. Their mission? Not defense, not peacekeeping. Surveillance of mineral routes, political gatherings, civilian infrastructure, and none of it had been disclosed. Traoré gathered his top advisors in a closed-door emergency session. Some were shocked. Others, not surprised at all. "We should go to the African Union. Let the international press handle it. A quiet back channel with Paris may fix this." But Traoré stood at the edge of the war room map, eyes fixed on the dot labeled Voltaire. Then, quietly, he spoke. "The last time we whispered, we lost a generation." A pause. Then he said what no one expected. "I will go myself. No one else gets hurt." "Alone?" one minister gasped. "Without warning?" another asked. Traoré didn't answer. He simply picked up a plain folder, handed it to his intelligence chief, and walked out of the room. The silence he left behind was louder than any alarm, because for the first time in Burkina Faso's modern history, a president wasn't waiting for permission to reclaim his land. Within hours of receiving the leaked report, the Burkinabé Ministry of Foreign Affairs dispatched a formal inquiry to the French embassy in Ouagadougou. The message was direct, almost surgical. "We request immediate clarification on the presence of unregistered surveillance assets at Camp Voltaire." France's reply arrived just as quickly. "Fabricated claims, conspiracy theories, baseless speculation. Burkina Faso is advised to focus on regional stability, not manufactured tension." But behind those diplomatic words was a tremor. Within 24 hours, the French media machine ignited. National outlets ran synchronized headlines. Burkina's leader, spiraling into paranoia. Ibrahim Traoré, revolutionary or rogue? Anti-French? Sentiment endangers West Africa. TV analysts called him impulsive. Editors labeled him a populist looking for enemies. In Paris salons and think tanks, his name was spoken with a smirk, as if he were already a footnote. But inside French military intelligence, the tone was different. In a secure meeting room, General Alphonse Carrot looked at a red-dotted satellite image of Burkina Faso and muttered, "He better not cross that line." But Traoré had already crossed it, not with troops, not with sanctions, but with a plan no one in Paris could predict. He would not expose France through leaks. He would not hold a press conference. He would walk straight into the heart of their power and look them in the eye. While politicians in Europe debated strategy, Traoré was assembling a different kind of convoy. No weapons, no warheads, just one man unarmed, driving into a symbol of occupation. Because he knew, power fears silence more than bullets. And Traoré was ready to speak by standing still. The steel gates creaked open with the sound of metal resisting history. President Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, his boots touching ground. Most African heads of state had never dared to tread without permission. A French military base on African soil. The guards saluted out of protocol, but their eyes betrayed panic. A junior officer whispered into his radio, trembling, "He's inside. Alone. What do we do?" Minutes later, Colonel Devereaux, the French base commander, arrived, face pale but composed. He extended a hand. Traoré didn't shake it. He only nodded. "Mr. President, this is highly irregular." Traoré's voice was steady, almost gentle. "Irregular is building surveillance infrastructure on land you do not own." A long pause. Waiting for permission, Traoré continued walking. The air inside the command building was thick, not with hostility, but with uncertainty. Soldiers and officers stood at attention, unsure whether to salute or intercept. Cameras followed from above. Tension followed below. He passed by control rooms, supply corridors, and intelligence stations, observing everything, speaking to no one. Finally, he stopped in front of a restricted door marked Zone 3D, high security. He turned to Colonel Devereaux. "Open it." The Frenchman hesitated, blinking hard. "That area contains sensitive—" "I know what it contains. Open it." A long moment passed, one that could have snapped a nation in two. Then, reluctantly, the colonel nodded. A soldier entered the code. The doors slid open with a hiss, and inside was the truth France had tried to keep buried. Traoré didn't flinch. He simply stepped inside, as if he had always known, because this wasn't about seeing something new. It was about finally making it undeniable. The heavy doors slid open with a slow mechanical groan, revealing a space unlike any other on the base. Not a weapons cache, not a troop dormitory. This was an intelligence nerve center, built not for war, but for watching. Traoré stepped inside. Rows of compact surveillance drones, sleek and silent, sat fully armed and operational. Their wings bore no national insignia, just serial codes, untraceable, unaccountable. Along the far wall, encrypted communication terminals blinked steadily, manned by French techs who froze at the sight of the Burkinabé president. And then, on a massive, digital screen, lit in cold blue light, a live feed map of West Africa. Every region marked, every mineral deposit tagged, gold, uranium, lithium, even village activity, political meeting zones, activist routes, monitored in real time. This wasn't peacekeeping. This was possession without ownership, control without consent. Colonel Devereaux stepped forward, his voice a whisper. "It's standard protocol, intelligence sharing, joint operation data." Traoré said nothing. His eyes slowly scanned the room. His expression didn't shift, not in anger, not in shock. He already knew. What hurt wasn't the equipment, it was the confirmation. After a long silence, he finally turned toward the colonel and spoke quietly. "Call your commander in Paris. Tell him I'll wait here." Devereaux froze. You want to stay? On the base?" Traoré nodded. "I'm done sending reports. If they want to explain this, let them explain it to my face." And with that, he sat calmly in the very room they had sworn he'd never see. No guards, no camera crews, just one man, waiting to be answered, not as a subordinate, but as the rightful owner of the soil beneath their boots. By sunrise, the footage had already escaped the walls of Camp Voltaire. A grainy video, no more than 40 seconds long, taken on a soldier's smuggled phone, was now circulating across the internet like wildfire. President Ibrahim Traoré, calm and unarmed, walking through the halls of a French military base like it was his ancestral home, not a foreign installation. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked, with history at his back and the eyes of a continent at his feet. He didn't come with an army, one caption read. He came with truth. The video reached 10 million views in 6 hours. By noon, it was trending globally. In Paris, panic. The French Foreign Ministry held an emergency press conference. "We are reviewing footage of a misinterpreted protocol event." But the tremble, in their words, betrayed the truth. They had been caught. Western allies scrambled to contain the narrative. Statements poured in. "We are deeply concerned. We urge restraint. We reaffirm our commitment to mutual cooperation." But it was too late. The people had already chosen their headline. In Dakar, murals began to appear overnight. Traoré painted in black and gold, stepping through flames. In Lagos, protesters held signs. "One man, one step, one revolution." In Kinshasa, schoolchildren reenacted the scene for a drama competition. In Nairobi, a popular rapper released a freestyle titled, "He Walked In." This wasn't about policy anymore. It was about presence. A man had walked into a lion's den, not to roar, but to remind the world, Africa is not afraid of its past, and it will not ask permission for its future. Back inside Camp Voltaire, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to explosive. French military advisors huddled in a side room, their voices hushed but urgent. The footage had gone viral, and President Traoré was still seated calmly in the restricted zone, sipping tea brought by a stunned junior officer. General Carreau, patched in via secure line from Paris, gave the order with cold precision. Detain him immediately. He's humiliating the Republic. But when the French colonel relayed the command to the Joint Command Unit, a mix of Burkinabé and French-trained African officers, no one moved. Captain Doumbia, a Burkinabé officer stationed at the base, stood straight and responded clearly. "We follow our president, not your orders." The room froze. Another African officer stepped forward. "This is our land, our base, our people. We are not colonial recruits anymore." No weapons were drawn, no flags burned, no threats exchanged, but the line had been drawn. French officers, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, watched as the power shifted, not with violence, but with clarity. Outside the base, hundreds of civilians had gathered, waving flags and singing. They weren't armed, they weren't angry, they were proud. The message was now bigger than Traoré. It wasn't about one man entering a military base. It was about a continent waking up on its own soil. Sovereignty wasn't being negotiated anymore. It was being lived, and, as the sun began to rise over Camp Voltaire, the French command realized something they hadn't prepared for. They still held the weapons, but they no longer held control. At precisely 10 a.m., with the world already watching, President Ibrahim Traoré stepped in front of a small podium, hastily arranged inside the heart of Camp Voltaire. No national backdrop, no scripted anthem, just the Burkinabé flag, folded neatly on the table beside him, and behind him, a wall of classified French surveillance equipment, exposed to the world. Microphones from Al Jazeera, BBC, France 24, and African Independent. Outlets crowded before him. Traoré did not raise his voice. He simply looked into the lens and said, "This is not a speech, it's a mirror." He turned, gesturing toward the drone racks and encrypted comms. "They told us this was a partnership. But what kind of partner hides this behind locked doors on someone else's land?" He held up a document, one of the flight logs intercepted inside the restricted zone. "These aren't for peacekeeping. These are for watching, for mapping, for extracting." He paused, eyes heavy but unshaken. "If they can do this to us quietly, what have they done to the rest of Africa?" Silence, then a rustle of camera shutters. Then thunder, not in the sky, but across the continent. In Nairobi, university students filled halls to live stream the moment. In Accra, a youth coalition issued a statement. "Today, we saw what courage looks like." In Kinshasa, a radio host paused mid-broadcast and whispered, "The colonizers didn't retreat. They adapted. Until now." Traoré didn't call for war. He called for awareness and accountability. And that made him more dangerous than any army, because this wasn't a press conference. This was the unveiling of a truth too long buried, and the beginning of a continent that would never again close its eyes. The fallout was immediate. Within 72 hours of President Traoré's press conference, France convened a high-level security meeting behind closed doors in Paris. By morning, military transports were already loading crates from Camp Voltaire, dismantling communication arrays, removing drones, erasing traces. The world saw what looked like a retreat. France framed it differently. As a gesture of de-escalation and respect for bilateral ties, France will begin the removal of its strategic assets from Burkina Faso. But embedded in the final lines of the official statement was a veiled threat. President Traoré has escalated tensions that will have consequences for regional stability and diplomatic partnerships. It was cold, sharp, calculated. And yet when a journalist at Ouagadougou's national press briefing read the statement aloud, Traoré simply smiled, not defiantly, but knowingly. He stepped forward, leaned into the microphone and replied, "We've been living with consequences for 100 years. It's your turn." The room erupted, not in applause but in quiet awe, because in that moment, Traoré didn't just speak for Burkina Faso. He spoke for Guinea, for Mali, for Niger, for every nation that had signed away its voice in exchange, for aid wrapped in control. Outside the base, Burkinabé civilians watched French equipment trucks roll out. They didn't jeer. They stood silently, as if witnessing an empire loosen its grip. In Paris, diplomatic chatter turned bitter. Think tanks debated sanctions. Military analysts called for containment strategies. But Traoré had already shifted the battlefield, from weapons to words, from troops to truth. And France, for the first time in a generation, realized something deeply unsettling. Africa was no longer asking, it was reclaiming. Exactly 1 month later, under a sky softened by the early morning sun, a quiet ceremony unfolded at the once feared Camp Voltaire. The base, once a symbol of occupation and secrecy, was now surrounded by Burkinabé soldiers in fresh uniforms, school children waving miniature flags, and farmers who had once walked past its gates with lowered eyes. A podium stood at the center courtyard. No red carpet, no military parade, just clarity, sovereignty, and presence. President Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, not in grand uniform, but in the same style that had come to define his leadership: modest, firm, unshakable. As the French flag was slowly lowered from the mast, no one booed. But when the Burkinabé flag rose to take its place, a silence fell across the crowd. Reverent, ancestral, victorious. Children whispered the national anthem. Veterans stood at attention, and the wind carried the green, red, and gold above walls that had, for too long, hidden secrets from the very soil they stood upon. Traoré did not deliver a fiery speech. He simply unveiled a bronze plaque on the outer wall of the command building. It read, "This land was never foreign. We just forgot to say it out loud." Then, turning to the crowd behind him, students, farmers, mothers, soldiers, he said softly, "Let this place no longer be feared. Let it be remembered." He stepped down from the podium and walked the base, not alone this time, but surrounded by the people it now belonged to. There were no drums, no fireworks, just the sound of footsteps, a people finally walking forward together. Because sometimes the loudest revolution begins in silence, and a single step forward is all it takes to wake a continent.